When I was 13, my father took me out for a night of wrestling. Now, I'd not been to a wrestling match before, so I was totally unprepared for what it was like in person. I mean, I'd seen it on television, but on television it's got commercials and we have a very far view of it, and it just kind of moves as if it's just a regular little show. But in person, where my father took me, it was an entire other world. There was this whole arena, and it went up the sides of this conference center in White Plains, New York, and down at the bottom, from what felt like a dizzying height, was this wrestling ring. And when the voice came on to let us know that there was a match happening between a local hometown boy from White Plains, who in retrospect I don't think was really from White Plains, and none other than the Iron Sheik, Nikolai Volkov, and Sergeant Slaughter, it was a palpitatingly amazing experience for me. Totally blew me away as this echoing announcer told us that it was the East versus West, that this was going to be the Russian and the Iranian character versus the all-American hometown boy and the protecting Sergeant Slaughter. When the event started up after a number of other wrestling matches before it, it started with Nikolai Volkov demanding that we all rise for the Russian national anthem, and the Iron Sheik pulled out a Soviet Union flag and waved it back and forth while the Russian sang this incredibly dour anthem, the anthem, I might add, of my homeland, and the audience just lost it. They were throwing things onto the ring, popcorn and garbage and programs, and then out came Sergeant Slaughter, ready to fight for our honor and freedom. It was an experience. I mean, if you look back, you might say it's just a little wrestling match, but to a 13-year-old me, it had an entirely different effect. I knew that however I could pull it off, I wanted to be a performer. This is Jason Scott. You're listening to the Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It podcast, a podcast about history, technology, and debt. Thanks to Jeff Atwood, Daniel Boyd, and the hundreds of other supporters who help make this podcast possible. I was listening to an interview with the performer Jack Black, who does acting but is also a relatively accomplished singer, and he talked about being in some sort of high school play where he was required to sing, and he discovered during that time, during the rehearsals, that he actually had a lot more to give in terms of music than he even knew. And he knew he could sing okay, but he started to reach out and realized he had a really good voice for what he was doing, and he wanted to develop that talent. In the same way, in high school, I realized that I had an advantage that my classmates didn't have, which is I don't get stage fright. If I go and stand up in front of a group of people with something to say, I'm completely at ease. The nervousness I might have wouldn't be more than the nervousness one would have about finding yourself in a point of authority and not having your notes with you. In 1987, I ran for class president, the class of 1988, and one of the requirements was that the whole class would be herded into bleachers, and all of the candidates would have 5 minutes to give a speech about why they thought they should be that position. For a lot of the other candidates, this was a terrifying requirement. They wanted to go through the pantomime of high school government, but they were just beside themselves having to stand up in front of this set of faces. But for me, I ran because that's all I wanted. As soon as I found out there was a case where I would have a mandatory audience of my colleagues, I jumped at it. I ran as a joke candidate. Let's not be weird here. I had no interest, no idea about being a governing person. I had nothing to do with any of that. I wouldn't have known where to begin in the first 2 days. But I loved the idea of doing a stand-up act. So when I ran, I had a whole range of ridiculous requirements. For instance, I wanted to turn the foreign language lab, where you listen to tapes about foreign languages, into an on-campus McDonald's. Huge applause. I wanted us to have digital clocks in all of the classrooms. Huge applause. And I wanted to change our school mascot. The school mascot was the Greeley Quaker. For some reason, we are the Quakers. And I wanted us to become the Greeley Ferrets. So in the huge climax of my 5-minute speech, I reached into a pet carrier and pulled out my ferret, Farah, and I raised her aloft and said, "This is a small, smelly, angry, furious rat. It is the best representative of our school I can imagine." Audience lost it. It was an exhilarating experience. After being in the darkness of my early high school career and moving to this new town and reinventing myself, this was just a great capstone. To be sure, it absolutely nailed me as a weirdo. I was definitely part of the weird gang. There were a group of us who hung out in an area called the Quad in Horace Greeley High School, which was basically a courtyard that had benches. And we did all sorts of crazy, weird things and imagined ideas and projects and argued about politics and chess. And I was definitely a part of that. Proudly a part of it, and this was that group sending an envoy to mess with the school's heads. But it did let me know that performing was something that I wanted to integrate into my life. I definitely loved being in front of people and bringing them something. That's what I'm doing now, after all. So what makes this somewhat different is I'm also a huge bookish nerd. I love going through reams of information, designating them under different categories, and then representing them under the fixed categories. I've been following that Bamiga Sector 1 project that I mentioned in my last podcast, and they're up to 25 sets of floppy disks as of this podcast. And the process of downloading their new packs, shuffling them a little bit for the Internet Archive, and then uploading them into an object, nerdy as it gets, and I love doing it. I spent an hour or two last night working with a contributor to bring in thousands of hours of performances and make sure that the metadata matched up and that all of the posters and everything else were all in sync. And this required a bit of coding and a bit of checking with the upload client for the Internet Archive. It was as faced to the screen as you can imagine. But then Sunday, I was more than happy to go in front of 100 people and talk about my history with Wikipedia. It wouldn't have mattered to me if it was 10 people, 100 people, or a few thousand people. I love performing. And this is a mutation that has given me an enormous amount of opportunity that I hope I've taken advantage of. As I get into my late 40s, I find myself being asked to speak at events. This year I'm speaking in Bulgaria, I'm speaking in Seattle, I'm speaking in New York City, and I'm speaking in California. Other opportunities might come up, and I certainly will jump at them, but there's no case where I sit around worried about being on stage. Instead, I like to turn back and focus on telling the best story and having all of the information ready to go so that the people who walk in to the theater feel that they have gotten something for their time. A couple weeks ago, I asked people to give me some Twitter accounts I could follow so I could expand my information and point of view. And there was one person who posted some pretty good stuff and had some good recommends. But at one point, they did say, that it was better for a talk to have pretty good information and be presented poorly than it is for a talk to be presented extremely well but not have as much information. Sadly, I disagree. For a really weird reason. When I look at a room full of people watching a speaker or a presentation, I take it pretty seriously that you take, let's say, an hour presentation, multiply it by the number of people in that room, and that's how much human life you have decided this presentation is worth. You've decided that if there's 50 people in the room and they're there for an hour, you've decided that a little more than 2 days of human life should be thrown into the burning of this presentation. It's something I feel inside when I have 500 people or 1,000 people. And I think it comes less from mind games than having respect for the people who are there. And so no, I'd much rather have somebody give a pretty good presentation that really makes an audience feel enthused about a subject, and then have them say, well, that was a pretty light overview. That didn't cover everything. I'm now inspired to go learn more and make an even better presentation that gives you even more depth. For a certain group of you, there is a wish or desire to let people know about what you're working on and what it's about, and you want to share it with people. So I'm just going to use this podcast episode to just talk a little bit about things that I've picked up over the years that really, I think, help people. Not everybody is completely comfortable on a stage, and I understand that, but there are steps you can take to ensure that the presentation you do give on stage is the best that it can be. And the first question will always be, should I even be on stage? The answer, almost always, is yes. It's places like conferences, like presentations, or even talking to a group of 5 or 10 people in a private party or a meeting that allows a human soul to share its contents with other human souls. It's the methodology that built civilization. It's one of the finest things you can do is be in the role of a teacher or eye-opener or presenter, even if it's just for 1 hour at one conference in 1 year. People really get hung up when they talk about presentations, and there's an entire philosophy and industry, frankly, about how to give presentations and how to get in front of people. The first thing I have to stress is nobody's perfect. Nobody gets it right the first time, the 10th time, the 100th time. You'll always be able to find in even the most smooth comedians, the most amazing television presenters, the DJs, the radio hosts, you can find Ira Glass of This American Life has a recording of himself when he was in NPR long before he ever did his most famous current show. And he sounds as monotone and dull and quiet as you can imagine. And he points out that he had been a correspondent on NPR for years at that point. He didn't become the Ira Glass that people know about for some time. And there are always recordings that are embarrassments. They are young, naked baby pictures for people who do audio and presentations. So never look at how you do the first, the second, the 10th as being the end of your continuum. Care about your subject. It sounds pretty basic, but there are cases where people do talks that they are making up to fill space. They're told, oh, I have to do a presentation, huh? Oh, it's a X convention, an X conference, so I should do my talk on X. Or Y in the scope of X. And yeah, maybe the people who organize it will force people to choose. But if you are being given a slot, don't propose a talk to get accepted. Propose a talk you want to give. Choose a subject that you would want to get up in front of people about. It sounds pretty basic, but sometimes people try to play the room. They find out that it's a group of people that are interested in this one little subject, and you feel that you have to talk about that subject. I have found that people who are there for a computer conference or a gaming conference or are there for technology don't mind hearing talks about failure or personal history or beekeeping or anything, as long as the presenter feels like they care. If you close your eyes right now, I mean right now, unless you're driving, and you suddenly think of what would you want to be doing right now? Like if you walked out the door and you turned to the right and you had a little building there, and that building's where you do the thing you care about, what would be in that building? What would it be full of? That's what you should be giving a talk about. Talk about why you want to be in that little building more than anything in the world. What goes right and excites you? What goes wrong and dismays you? Why should people be in that building? Why should they have their own little building with that stuff? What part of their lives is missing a piece because they don't have that too? That's the talk. That's the conversation. That's the presentation. That's what you should be giving. There are people who look at these sorts of conversations, and specifically presentations at conferences, as trying to be an all-inclusive 101 in some sort of subject. They want it that a person walks in and they're given everything they need to get started. And I actually don't quite believe that. I don't think of a presentation or a conversation as being one that's a self-encapsulated biosphere of all of the information and points that you need. I think of it as a bundle of threads, a bundle of rope ends, and each rope end has something you're talking about from this presentation conversation. And it is something where a person grabs onto that rope and they walk away from you following that rope to the more amazing and expansive subject that they discovered because you put it in front of them. You can make everybody happy without feeling the incredible pressure to do a world-class start-to-finish information session in 40 minutes. And there's another thing that you have an advantage of in the modern era that previous public speakers and conversationalists didn't have. You have an infinite, literally infinite amount of examples to work from. There are talks and presentations and conversations out there that are recorded onto video sharing sites or downloadable from the Internet Archive, in which you can listen to them and be enthralled and produce a collection of what are your favorite ones, and then go back and say, why? Why did I like this talk more than anything? And, perhaps more importantly, what about these other talks? Why didn't I like them? Why didn't I like listening to this person? What part of this conversation was fascinating and boring? Now, there's one weird exception to all of this, and that is the TED Talk. The TED Talk has become almost a cliche, and I went to a TED once, and I will tell you that one of the tricks that the TED Talks do is, first of all, they are incredibly short. They are not usually more than 20 minutes in the original. You have a person who walks onto stage, gives an incredibly rehearsed speech, and I want to point out that people are often being forced or perhaps invited to come in the morning and let them do a full walkthrough, and I mean a full rehearsal of the entire talk that morning on stage when nobody is there, to allow the video and audio production crews and the person to turn it into a staid, straightforward performance with really, honestly, no sense of improv energy or anything else. Everything there has been pre-packaged. And then they actually go a little further. They'll take the 20-minute talk and then they'll squelch it down to like 17 minutes, to 15, to 5 minutes. They'll make a person look like they are a genius by just doing all of the editing for them and then putting that out. And as a result, TED Talks tend to have a very straightforward kind of, there's a problem, I solve the problem, isn't life great, everybody claps. And those aren't the presentations that are my favorite presentations, and I think that they're not a very good template for somebody who has information they want to get across. I mean, when I went to the DEF CON conference my first year, which was in the late 1990s, there was a guy who gave a talk about cheating casinos. And again, it was less about computer hacking. It was really about talking about the systems by which people would be able to extract money from casinos that casinos were not prepared to give. Of course, they're prepared to give almost none. But what made his talk great, and I must stress he was actually just reading off of an outline, was he gave funny stories. And he really gave a sense of enjoying the thing he was talking about. I mean, he liked talking about casino fraud. And he also shared blame between the people who were trying to cheat the casinos and then incompetent work of the casinos to calculate odds in the face of promotion and activity. So they would have certain days when they would change up the odds, and mathematically the odds would scream into the player's favor for at least a couple days. And he mentioned people flying in and telling each other. He talked about, modifying the chips and all the different ways that the slot machines have been manipulated both by casinos and by charlatans over the years. I came out of that talk, a talk which is something like 18 or 19 years ago, with just a blown mind about all of this stuff going on that I didn't know about. And in the years hence, I would look up about casino cheats and slot machines and odds and how casinos worked. And his talk was a series of threads. There is a presenter named G. Mark Hardy, and I found his talks with their storytelling style and a real personal affectation on everything to be inspiring, because they were thoughts about being a heavily technical person and then integrating that into your life and your dreams and your wishes. It wasn't really something where I learned how to flip this bit or make this piece of code change. Instead, it helped me learn how to be a person. There's a speaker named Richard Thiem. He does talks about spirituality against technology. Beautiful stuff. Definitely not a technical rundown. And just this week was the speed running charity organization, Awesome Games Done Quick, which has days upon days of people playing games and talking about speed running. And I listened to a 3-hour panel presentation during a game of Super Mario Sunshine. And the person who was doing the speed running, Average Trey, had 3 people with him who were all experts in Super Mario Sunshine. And even though I really like Super Mario Sunshine, the level and the depth of their interest and the way that they turned it all into a happy conversation, almost like the greatest games night at your house that you could imagine. It was a spectacular thing. They talked about frame perfection and aspects of the code that were different, and they were friendly and so open-hearted about this thing they cared about. And you just want to be a part of that community, and for 3 hours, you kind of are. Now, I could go on for hours and hours about talks that I've liked, and I probably am due to make a talks I really enjoy list somewhere. But what I'm trying to get at is, it is my fervent belief that sitting inside of all of you is some talk, some conversation, some presentation that is equally fascinating, insightful, and inspiring. I want to hear it from you. I want to hear you talking. And I don't mean writing. Writing is a whole different art. I want to hear you talking about the thing you care about, because it is a reckoning to your own position in life and what matters to you that makes you a better person. So much of our lives are lived inside of our head. We listen to ourselves, we craft ideas inside of our mind, and then we polish them to a fine obsidian finish, ensuring that they are jewels that can never be topped by the terrible crap that comes out of this flapping meat mouth. And it's healthy, because you then take this crystalline form inside your mind and then you compare it to everything else in life, and it always falls short. The story may be not quite true, but I had heard that there was a Japanese word, and it would best translate as in your head lover. And it's the idea that there is a person inside of your mind who is the perfect mate for you. They never cry. They never let you down. They're never going to desert you. And you compare that person to all of the prospective people who could be your partner in life. And they always, always lose to the in-your-head lover that is an A+ forever, because they're nothing. They're just synapses firing. They're not somebody who holds you close or listens to what you have to say or shares an idea with you and collaborates with you and makes something better by working with you. And the in-your-head lover is something that can be the in-your-head speech, the in-your-head idea, the in-your-head song that never finds its actual true destiny. And I would love for you to honestly let it out. It took a wrestling match between the Iron Sheik, Nikolai Volkov, Sergeant Slaughter, and the probably fake hometown boy to help me know what I am. And maybe I've helped you a bit too. This is Jason Scott talks his way out of it. Thanks to James Bekoyanu, Sam Johnston, and the hundreds of other supporters who helped me get out of debt. This is a brand new year, and I have made arrangements with a new accountant who lives pretty close to where I live here in New York, and we are going to begin to file for my 2017 taxes. I expect it to be a little weird, a little bit of a reckoning. I don't know under the new laws if I owe more or less, but with your help, I don't go into it with fear. You got to the end of this podcast, and I am inviting you to record yourself. You can do it on your cell phone. There are apps aplenty for voice recording. And I would love for you to record 5 minutes, just 300 seconds of you talking about something. And I will happily listen to it and respond to you with notes. That's a free service. It's not tied to anything. There is no expiration date, and I can't wait to hear you.